My son jabbed his finger into my chest 15 times in front of the entire family. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Dad, you are a parasite in my house." While he did this, his wife stood by the dining table aiming her phone at me, laughing and mocking my worn clothes for her followers. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply walked away, and then I decided to wipe out their entire world. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The rain beat relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sprawling Seattle estate, blurring the city skyline into a smear of gray and gold. We were gathered in the formal dining room for what was supposed to be a routine Sunday family dinner. Extended relatives sat around the massive mahogany table, the clinking of silverware scraping against fine china creating a hollow, nervous soundtrack to the evening. I sat near the corner wearing the same faded wool sweater I had favored for the better part of a decade. I had spent 40 years of my life as a structural engineer, calculating load-bearing capacities, identifying stress fractures, and preventing catastrophic collapses. I knew how to recognize a foundation that was about to give way. I just never expected to see those same structural failures in my own flesh and blood. The tension had been thick all evening, radiating from my 38-year-old son, Blake. He was the founder of a tech startup that was supposedly on the verge of revolutionizing logistics software, a venture that demanded a constant, exhausting projection of success. Beside him was his wife, Courtney, a 35-year-old lifestyle influencer who spent her days meticulously curating a fictional reality for strangers on the internet. I cleared my throat, waiting for a lull in the forced conversation. "Blake," I asked quietly, "did you remember to pick up my post-operative medication from the pharmacy this afternoon? I had undergone a minor knee procedure earlier in the week, and my mobility was temporarily restricted." It was a simple question, a minor favor asked of a son by his father. I did not anticipate that those 14 words would serve as the detonation sequence for the explosive demolition of our family. Blake dropped his heavy silver fork onto his plate with a deafening clatter. The noise silenced the entire room. He slowly turned his head toward me, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles fluttered under his skin. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were completely hollowed out by a rage I had never seen directed at me. He stood up from his chair, knocking it backward onto the imported rug. He marched around the edge of the table, his expensive Italian leather shoes heavy on the hardwood floor, until he was standing directly over me. The entire dining room froze. Aunts, uncles, and cousins lowered their eyes, staring intently at their half-eaten meals, succumbing to the cowardice of self-preservation. No one wanted to draw the ire of the supposedly wealthy tech genius. I looked up at him, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "You sit there," Blake hissed, his voice vibrating with a venom that seemed to have been festering for years. "You sit there in that pathetic moth-eaten sweater, drinking my wine, eating my food, and you have the absolute audacity to demand that I run your errands." The stress of his impending Series B funding round had evidently fractured his facade, but the words pouring out of him were not born of momentary panic. They were the absolute, unvarnished truth of how he viewed me. I did not flinch. Blake raised his right hand and thrust his index finger directly into my sternum. 1, 2, 3. With every syllable, he drove his finger into my chest, physically punctuating his disdain. "You produce nothing. 4, 5, 6. You contribute absolutely nothing to this ecosystem. 7, 8, 9. I am fighting every single day to build an empire to maintain this standard of living, and you are just dead weight. 10, 11, 12. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face. "You are a parasite in my house." 13, 14, 15. The physical impact was sharp, a stinging rhythm against my healing ribs, but the psychological impact was a profound, chilling clarity. His house. The absolute arrogance of that statement stripped away the final remnants of my paternal leniency. 5 years ago, after my wife Diane passed away, the silence of our sprawling suburban home had become too heavy to bear. I sold the highly lucrative engineering firm I had built from the ground up, liquidating my lifetime of labor into a substantial fortune. I purchased this multi-million-dollar Seattle estate in cash. I placed the deed entirely in Blake's name under the guise of tax efficiency and estate planning, choosing to reside quietly in the modest attached guest house on the property. I had effectively purchased the stage upon which he was now publicly executing my dignity. I slowly turned my head toward the opposite end of the table. Courtney was not staring at her plate like the cowardly relatives. She was standing upright, her pristine white smile stretched wide across her face. She held her latest model smartphone up at eye level, the camera lens pointed directly at me. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. "Oh my God. Look at him," she sneered, panning the camera to capture my worn clothing and my silent, seated posture. "He literally thinks he owns the place. This is what happens when you let budget-class people get too comfortable in luxury spaces. Blake is finally setting boundaries. I am so posting this to the private circle." The complete absence of human decency in her voice was the final variable in my internal equation. They did not view me as a father or a benefactor. They viewed me as an unsightly blemish on their curated aesthetic, a depleting resource that needed to be managed, mocked, and ultimately discarded. I did not yell. I did not defend myself. I did not remind Blake that the very roof sheltering his arrogant head was purchased with 40 years of my sweat. Silence is not a surrender. It is the tactical withdrawal before a devastating counter-offensive. I slowly pushed my chair back, stood up, and looked my son dead in the eye for 3 agonizing seconds. I saw no remorse, only the frantic chest-heaving adrenaline of a man who believed he had just conquered his oppressor. I turned my back on the silent dining room, walked out the heavy oak doors, and stepped into the freezing Seattle rain. The cold water soaked through my wool sweater instantly, but I felt nothing. As I walked across the manicured lawn toward the secluded guest house, the emotional shock of the betrayal evaporated, replaced entirely by the cold, mechanical logic of a structural engineer. Blake had not just snapped under pressure. The sheer venom of his attack, coupled with Courtney's premeditated recording, indicated a strategic shift in their behavior. They were laying the groundwork for an eviction. I entered the guest house, immediately sliding the heavy brass deadbolt into place. The space was small, Spartan, and utterly silent. I walked past the modest kitchenette and went directly to the small study area in the back room. I shoved the heavy leather armchair aside and pulled back the corner of the Persian rug to reveal the steel floor safe embedded in the concrete foundation. I did not need to sit down to process the heartbreak. I needed my leverage. 2 years ago, when Blake's tech startup was nothing more than a failing prototype hemorrhaging cash, he had come to me begging for salvation. I did not give him a gift. I gave him a lifeline in the form of a heavily structured convertible debt note. It was seed money that kept his doors open, but it carried a specific lethal clause. At my sole discretion, or upon the initiation of his Series B funding round, that debt would automatically convert into a 51% controlling equity stake in his entire company. I possessed the legal right to seize his empire the moment it became valuable. I spun the dial on the safe. 34, 12, 88. The heavy steel bolts clicked back. I pulled the heavy door open and reached inside for the internal fireproof lockbox where I kept the physical promissory note and the original ink signatures. My hand touched cold, jagged metal. The internal lockbox had been forcefully pried open. Deep, violent scratch marks scored the steel around the latch, indicating it had been forced with a heavy crowbar or a crow's foot pry bar. I threw the lid open. The thick manila envelope containing the convertible debt note was gone. Every other document, my passport, my wife's death certificate, the minor cash reserves, remained entirely untouched. This was not a burglary. This was a surgical extraction. I sat back on my heels staring at the empty space in the lockbox. The puzzle pieces rapidly clicked into place. The impending Series B funding round was scheduled to close next week, bringing in tens of millions in venture capital. Blake's investors would demand a clean cap table. They would never proceed if they knew a retired engineer held a dormant majority stake in the enterprise. Blake needed that debt erased. He needed to destroy the physical proof of my leverage before the auditors arrived. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the encrypted application that controlled the discrete security cameras I had installed inside the guest house. I tapped the icon for the camera angled toward the study. The screen flickered and displayed a stark, unyielding error message. No events found. Archive deleted. The footage from the past 48 hours had been completely wiped from the cloud server. Blake had not merely insulted me at the dinner table. He had orchestrated a coordinated preemptive strike against my financial sovereignty. He had robbed me, destroyed the evidence, and then utilized the family dinner to provoke a confrontation. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to act erratic and unhinged on Courtney's camera. He was building a narrative to justify removing me from the property, entirely unaware that the man he was dealing with had spent a lifetime designing structures meant to withstand Category 5 hurricanes. He believed he had severed my only lifeline. He believed the theft of a single piece of paper granted him absolute immunity. He was disastrously mistaken. I did not confront him. I did not march back into the main house and demand my documents. That would only alert him to the fact that I had discovered the breach. I checked my watch. It was nearing midnight. The rain was falling in thick, heavy sheets, turning the driveway into a river of dark water. I grabbed my heavy trench coat, pulled my keys from the counter, and slipped out the back door of the guest house. I avoided starting my primary vehicle, opting instead for the old, unassuming sedan I kept parked near the maintenance shed. I drove out of the estate without turning on the headlights until I reached the main road, disappearing into the torrential downpour. I did not use my personal smartphone. I knew Blake paid the family cellular plan, which meant he had administrative access to the call logs and potentially the location tracking data. I drove 3 miles down the highway until I spotted the glowing neon sign of a 24-hour electronics and convenience store. I parked in the shadows at the edge of the lot, walked inside and purchased a cheap, prepaid burner phone with a stack of untraceable $20 bills. I sat in the cold, damp interior of my sedan, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. I tore the plastic packaging off the cheap device, activated the network, and dialed a number I had committed to memory years ago. I did not call a family friend. I did not call a therapist. I called Vincent Navarro. Vince was a corporate attorney whose reputation in the Seattle financial district bordered on the predatory. He was a man devoid of sentimentality, a legal surgeon who specialized in hostile takeovers and the quiet annihilation of corporate adversaries. The line rang twice before a sharp, fully awake voice answered. "Speak." "Vince," I said, my voice echoing hollowly in the dark car. "It is Ken Lawson." There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the sound of a leather chair creaking. "Ken, I was just about to call your private line. I received a highly irregular notification from the county courthouse automated filing system 3 hours ago. I assume this is not a social call." "What did they file, Vince? Tell me exactly what the structural damage is." "Blake's legal team submitted an ex parte motion to the Superior Court." "This afternoon," Vince replied, his voice dropping into a register of cold, professional detachment. "They are moving to execute a total asset freeze on your personal checking, savings, and investment accounts." "How is that legally possible, without a hearing?" I demanded, feeling the cold air in the car suddenly grow suffocating. "They are utilizing a medical power of attorney," Vince explained. "A temporary directive you signed 3 years ago during your cardiac ablation surgery. You gave Blake authority to manage your finances for a 2-week recovery window. It appears the revocation paperwork was never properly filed. He has attached a sworn psychiatric evaluation signed by a private physician, claiming you are suffering from rapid onset dementia and acute paranoia. They are arguing that you are an immediate danger to your own financial estate. The audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking. Blake was not just robbing me of the startup equity. He was actively suffocating my financial oxygen. He was using a document born of my trust during a moment of medical vulnerability to legally enslave me. He was locking me out of my own life. How long do I have before the banks comply with the court order? I asked, my mind racing through the mathematical probabilities of my remaining assets. Less than 48 hours, Vince warned. The judge will review the emergency motion by Tuesday morning. Once that gavel falls, you will not be able to buy a cup of coffee without your son's explicit documented permission. He is backing you into a corner, Ken. He wants you destitute, powerless, and entirely dependent on his mercy. I looked out through the rain-streaked windshield at the flickering neon lights of the convenience store. The physical ache in my chest, where my son had jabbed his finger, faded into absolute nothingness. The illusion of family had been totally eradicated. When a load-bearing pillar is compromised by rot, you do not attempt to paint over the damage. You strip the structure down to the foundation, you isolate the decaying material, and you excise it with absolute prejudice. Blake wanted a war of attrition. I would give him an instantaneous, catastrophic collapse. Vince, I said, my voice dropping to a low, unyielding whisper. Empty my primary accounts immediately. Wire everything to the offshore shell. Leave exactly $1,200 in the checking account. Let him freeze a ghost town. And Vince, yes, Ken, initiate protocol cascade. We are tearing the building down. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dark study of the guest house. I sat perfectly still while watching the progress bar on the secure banking portal fill with deliberate slowness. An engineer knows that before you demolish a building, you must first clear the blast radius. You must remove anything of value before the charges detonate. I typed in the sequence of numbers Vince Navarro had provided me earlier that evening. It was a routing sequence to a shell corporation I had established in the Cayman Islands 5 years ago. This was a quiet safety measure initiated shortly after Diane passed away. I never intended to use it against my own flesh and blood. Now it was my only lifeline. I selected my primary checking, savings, and investment accounts. The total balance glowed back at me. $4.5 million. I highlighted the entire sum and subtracted exactly $1,200. I wanted Blake to feel the momentary thrill of seizing my accounts, only to discover he had captured a rotting husk. I pressed the transfer key. The screen verified the transaction. The money vanished from domestic soil and was safely secured in an impenetrable offshore trust. My burner phone vibrated on the desk. A single text message from Vince read simply that the transfer was complete and the freeze was imminent. I deleted the message and powered down the device. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for the rats to take the bait. I did not have to wait long. At 9 in the morning, heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden porch of the guest house. The doorbell did not ring. Instead, a key rattled aggressively in the lock. The door swung open and hit the wall with a loud thud. Courtney stood in the threshold. She was dressed in pristine white designer athletic wear and held a custom coffee cup. She was projecting the effortless superiority she constantly curated for her online audience. She stepped into my living room without an ounce of hesitation. I sat quietly in my reading chair, with my hands folded over my lap. She looked around the modest space with open disgust before her eyes settled on me with a predatory gleam. She announced that it was done, and her voice was dripping with artificial sweetness. She told me Blake's lawyers pushed the paperwork through the emergency docket this morning, and the judge signed the order. She proudly stated my bank accounts were officially frozen. She taunted me by saying if I tried to go to the grocery store today and buy a loaf of bread, my cards would decline. I looked at her while keeping my face entirely blank. A poorly constructed foundation will always reveal its flaws when subjected to pressure. Courtney could not contain her arrogant delight. She stepped further into the room and raised her perfectly manicured hand to point directly at my face. She continued by telling me I was legally incapacitated. She took a slow sip of her coffee and gloated that Blake had total control over my estate, my medical decisions, and this property. She informed me they had already contacted a budget-friendly care facility 2 towns over, and they had a bed waiting for me. She described it as a state-run home that was very modest, but considering I produced absolutely nothing, it was exactly what I deserved. I remained silent and let her arrogance consume all the oxygen in the room. My lack of reaction seemed to irritate her. She wanted me to beg. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket and tapped the screen until the familiar and chaotic video of last night played. It showed Blake screaming at me while jabbing his finger into my chest and calling me a parasite. She held the screen up so I could see my own humiliation. She warned me not to think about fighting this eviction, and her tone dropped into a vicious sneer. She told me not to think about calling my lawyers or going to a judge to contest the power of attorney. She explicitly threatened that if I made this difficult for them, she would send this video to every single partner at my old engineering firm. I stared at the glowing screen. I had spent 40 years building a reputation of absolute integrity and unbreakable resolve in the Seattle commercial real estate sector. My former partners viewed me as a titan of industry. Courtney knew exactly what she was threatening. She declared she would post this to her entire following, and her voice rose with malicious excitement. She stated she would tell the world that the great Kenneth Lawson was nothing but a senile and abusive old man who drained his family dry. She promised to show them how pathetic I was and that my legacy would become a joke. She said my colleagues would pity me and I would be remembered as a crazy old man who had to be forcefully removed from his son's house. She ordered me to pack my bags because the transport van would arrive in 1 hour. She told me I was leaving this property and I was never coming back. I slowly stood up from my chair. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not plead for my dignity. An engineer does not argue with gravity. He simply redirects the load. I told her she was right, and my voice remained steady and completely devoid of emotion. I told her I was leaving. She blinked and was momentarily thrown off balance by my immediate compliance. She expected tears. She expected a pathetic struggle. I walked over to the small console table near the front door. I picked up a heavy silver key ring holding 2 simple brass keys. I turned and held them out to her. I told her to take them because she would need them. Courtney snatched the keys from my hand with a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. She looked down at the brass keys and assumed they belonged to the guest house and the maintenance shed. She believed I was handing over my ultimate surrender and relinquishing my final claim to the estate. She mocked me by calling it a smart choice and dropped the keys into her designer pocket. She said she was glad I finally realized I had absolutely no power here. She told me to have a nice life at the facility and to try not to cause trouble for the nurses. She turned on her heel and marched out the door while leaving it wide open behind her. She walked back toward the main house entirely oblivious to the trap that had just snapped shut around her ankle. I walked into my bedroom and pulled a single leather duffel bag from the closet. I packed exactly 3 days' worth of clothing along with my essential toiletries and the encrypted hard drive containing my financial backups. I did not pack photographs. I did not pack souvenirs. I severed my emotional attachment to the property the second Blake's finger struck my chest last night. As I zipped the bag closed, a cold and hard smile broke across my face. Courtney thought she held the keys to my absolute defeat. She had no idea that those 2 brass keys did not belong to the guest house. They belonged to a secure and climate-controlled storage unit located in the industrial district downtown. It was a storage unit that Miles Decker, my private investigator, had rented under a dummy corporation. That unit currently held boxes of physical and undeniable evidence proving that Courtney had been systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from Blake's startup company over the past 2 years. She had been routing venture capital funds through fake vendor invoices to finance her lavish influencer lifestyle and hide a mountain of secret credit card debt. I had handed her the physical evidence of her own federal fraud. When the authorities eventually traced the storage unit back to her possession, she would be holding the very keys that would lock her in a federal prison. She thought she was evicting a helpless old man. In reality, she had just accepted delivery of her own criminal indictment. I picked up my duffel bag and walked out the front door before locking it behind me. The rain had finally stopped and left the morning air crisp and clear. I walked to my sedan and tossed the bag onto the passenger seat before starting the engine. I did not look back at the sprawling Seattle estate. I drove down the winding driveway and past the massive iron gates before merging onto the highway. I was leaving Blake and Courtney to reign over a kingdom of ashes. They believed they had won the war. They did not realize the battlefield had been entirely rigged with explosives, and I held the only detonator. I drove toward the downtown financial district, ready to meet Miles and prepare the final sequence of their complete financial eradication. The glass doors of the Rainier Grand Hotel parted silently as I stepped into the sprawling marble lobby. The air inside was climate-controlled and smelled faintly of cedar and expensive citrus. It was a stark contrast to the damp Seattle morning I had just navigated. I walked directly to the concierge desk. I did not offer my real name. I handed the clerk a heavy corporate card bearing the name of the offshore shell company Vince Navarro had established for me years ago. Within 3 minutes, I was handed a magnetic keycard for a corner suite on the 32nd floor. I rode the elevator up in absolute silence. Blake and Courtney believed I was sitting in a transport van on my way to a state-run facility for the discarded elderly. They believed they had effectively erased me from the board. They had no idea I was currently standing in a suite that cost more per night than their first car, looking out through floor-to-ceiling windows at the very financial district they were desperately trying to conquer. I did not sit down on the plush velvet sofa. I walked to the heavy mahogany dining table in the center of the room and waited. Exactly 12 minutes later, a quiet knock sounded at the door. I opened it to find Miles Decker standing in the hallway. Miles was a former forensic auditor who had transitioned into private intelligence. He did not wear a trench coat or a fedora. He wore a sharply tailored gray suit and carried a reinforced leather briefcase. He possessed the exact same clinical detachment that I did. Where I looked at buildings and saw stress fractures, Miles looked at financial ledgers and saw lies. He stepped into the suite and locked the door behind him. He did not offer a greeting. He walked straight to the table, opened his briefcase, and began laying out thick stacks of paper. He told me it was worse than we thought. He stated that the entire foundation of Blake's startup was rotting from the inside out. I stood over the table and looked at the spreadsheets. I told him to walk me through the structural damage. Miles tapped a manicured finger against the top document. He explained that Blake was playing the role of a visionary tech founder for his investors, but the reality was a catastrophic failure of basic management. The burn rate of the company was astronomical. Blake had blown through the initial seed capital and the Series A funding in less than 18 months. He had leased an absurdly expensive commercial office space in the tech corridor, hired bloated marketing teams, and poured millions into vanity projects that yielded zero return on investment. Miles looked up at me and stated clearly that my son was not a genius. He was a fraud, drowning in corporate debt, and keeping the lights on by delaying vendor payments and lying on his quarterly projections. I stared at the numbers. The columns of red ink told a story of absolute desperation. This was why Blake was so frantic to close the Series B funding round next week. He did not need the venture capital to expand his software. He needed it to plug a multi-million-dollar hole in his sinking ship before the board of directors realized they were backing a phantom enterprise. I asked Miles what the fatal stress point was. I knew Blake was arrogant, but sheer incompetence was not enough to trigger the level of panic that led him to steal from my safe and try to lock me in a psychiatric ward. There had to be an active, catastrophic leak. Miles slid a second folder across the table. He told me the fatal stress point was my daughter-in-law. I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of bank statements, credit card bills, and wire transfer receipts. Miles explained that Courtney was not just curating a fake lifestyle for her online followers. She was actively funding it through corporate embezzlement. He pointed to a series of highlighted transactions. He detailed how Courtney had set up 3 dummy vendor corporations under her maiden name. For the past 2 years, she had been submitting fraudulent invoices to Blake's startup for consulting fees, branding services, and digital marketing campaigns that never actually existed. Because Blake was so desperate to maintain the illusion of success and so utterly blind to the operational details of his own company, he had been approving the invoices without a second glance. I felt a cold precision settle over my mind as I looked at the routing numbers. I asked Miles where the money was going. He laid out a stack of personal credit card statements bearing Courtney's name. He revealed that she was carrying over $200,000 in secret revolving debt. She had been using the stolen corporate funds to pay the minimum balances on her designer wardrobes, her luxury vacations, and the aesthetic procedures she constantly flaunted online. She was draining the company treasury to maintain a digital illusion of immense wealth. I realized in that moment why she had been so eager to help Blake evict me. She knew the upcoming Series B audit would scrutinize every single outgoing wire transfer. The venture capital auditors would instantly flag her dummy corporations. She needed Blake to secure my estate so they could quietly liquidate my assets and replace the stolen company funds before the investors opened the books. I was not just a parasite to them. I was their emergency bailout fund. I looked up from the documents and met Miles' gaze. I told him Blake broke into my floor safe last night. I explained that he stole the physical promissory note, the document that guaranteed my right to convert my initial loan into a 51% controlling equity stake in his company. Miles did not look surprised. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single pristine sheet of paper. He slid it across the mahogany table toward me. He told me Blake stole a worthless piece of paper. I looked down at the document. It was a digitally certified copy of my original convertible debt note. But it was not just a copy. It bore the official timestamp and digital seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Miles explained the masterstroke. He told me that 3 years ago, when I first provided the seed money, Vince Navarro did not just put the physical note in my safe. Vince was a man who planned for every possible structural failure. He had immediately filed a digitized, notarized, and tamper-proof copy of the debt agreement directly with the SEC under a blind corporate registry. I stared at the official government seal. The sheer magnitude of Blake's miscalculation echoed in the quiet room. He thought he had severed my leverage by prying open a metal box in the middle of the night. He believed destroying a piece of paper would clear his capitalization table and allow him to take millions from new investors without interference. Miles leaned forward and delivered the final devastating calculation. He stated that because the document was federally registered, Blake's attempt to destroy the physical copy and deny its existence to his new investors was no longer just a family dispute. By actively soliciting venture capital while attempting to conceal a majority stakeholder, Blake was committing federal wire fraud. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the sprawling city below. The rain had started to fall again, washing the glass in cold, gray streams. My son had demanded that I stop taking up space in his world. He had violated my home, stolen my property, and attempted to strip me of my fundamental human dignity, all to protect a kingdom built on lies and stolen money. I turned back to the table where the evidence of their absolute ruin sat waiting to be deployed. I did not feel sorrow for the boy I had raised. I only felt the unyielding resolve of an engineer preparing to demolish a condemned building. I picked up my burner phone and dialed Vince Navarro. I told him we had the blueprints of their collapse. I commanded him to prepare the equity conversion documents and to draft the commercial eviction notice for the estate. The silent phase of my retaliation was over. It was time to let them feel the ground drop out from under their feet. The glowing screen of the tablet illuminated the dark wood of the hotel table. Miles pushed the device toward me without a word. On the screen, my son stood in the dining room of the estate, his face contorted in rage. I watched his hand thrust forward, watching his finger strike my chest repeatedly. The audio was muted, but I did not need to hear the words. I had lived them. However, the video had been altered. A soft acoustic track played in the background, and a block of stylized text hovered over the footage. The text claimed that toxic family members will drain your peace and that setting boundaries with an abusive parent is the hardest but most necessary step for a healthy marriage. Courtney had posted the footage to her supposedly exclusive digital circle. She had meticulously framed the narrative to portray Blake as the long-suffering victim of a tyrannical and dependent father. She severely underestimated the velocity of the internet. Miles informed me that the video had breached her private circle within 10 minutes. A local Seattle business blog had acquired the footage and published it under a sensational headline questioning the private life of a rising tech star. The blog post was already circulating through the financial district. My personal cellular phone, which sat ignored on the edge of the table, began to vibrate continuously. Text messages and missed calls piled up on the screen. Former engineering colleagues, board members of local charities, and old neighbors were reaching out. Some demanded explanations, while others offered uncomfortable sympathies. My reputation, the flawless integrity I had cultivated over 40 decades of structural engineering, was actively burning in the digital square. Courtney believed she had executed a flawless character assassination. She assumed the public humiliation would force me into hiding and render me incapable of contesting the fraudulent power of attorney. She thought she was isolating a helpless old man. Instead, she had handed a forensic engineer the exact blueprint of her own demolition. I looked away from the buzzing phone and stared at the frozen image of Blake's face on the tablet. A structural failure always leaves a signature. By releasing the video, Courtney had unwittingly provided time-stamped visual evidence of Blake's volatile mental state, just days before he filed a sworn legal document, claiming he was the responsible party fit to manage my estate. I did not waste a single second drafting a public denial. I did not return the frantic calls from my former associates. I pushed the tablet back to Miles and told him to download the raw, unedited file from the blog servers. I instructed him to bypass the filtered version and extract the original audio. I needed the violent, unvarnished reality of Blake's tantrum. Miles nodded, and his fingers flew across the keyboard of his laptop, executing the extraction with clinical precision. I picked up my burner phone and dialed my attorney. The line connected immediately. I told Vince Navarro that we had a new variable. I informed him about the video circulating through the Seattle tech blogs. Vince replied that his paralegals had already flagged it and were preparing a cease and desist order to scrub it from the servers. I commanded him to stop the paralegals. I told Vince I did not want the video taken down. I wanted it amplified, but I wanted it aimed at a very specific target. I asked Vince for the name of the lead venture capital firm financing Blake's upcoming Series B funding round. Vince recited the name of a highly conservative investment group based out of San Francisco. They were notorious for their ruthless due diligence and their absolute intolerance for corporate liability. They had built their entire portfolio on founders who maintained pristine public images. I asked Vince to pull up the standard term sheet Blake would have signed during his initial funding negotiations. Vince confirmed my suspicion. The venture capital firm required every founder to adhere to a strict morality and ethics clause. Any behavior that brought public disgrace upon the company or indicated severe personal instability was grounds for an immediate withdrawal of funding. Furthermore, any evidence of financial malfeasance would trigger an automatic breach of contract. I told Vince we were going to build a care package for the lead investors. I instructed Miles to compile the exact transaction logs detailing Courtney's embezzlement scheme. I wanted the fake vendor invoices, the routing numbers tied to her maiden name, and the corresponding statements from her personal credit cards, proving she was draining the corporate treasury to fund her luxury lifestyle. I told Miles to bind those financial documents with the original unedited video of Blake physically assaulting me in the dining room. We were not going to threaten my son or negotiate a settlement. We were going to bypass him entirely and strike directly at the foundation of his empire. The investors were poised to wire tens of millions of dollars into his control next week. We were going to show them exactly what kind of chaotic, insolvent reality they were buying into. Miles worked in absolute silence, compiling the data packets into a single encrypted file. He verified the digital signatures on the bank records, ensuring that every single illicit transfer Courtney had authorized could be traced directly back to her personal accounts. He pulled the pristine audio from the raw video file, amplifying the moment Blake screamed that I was a parasite, while his company secretly hemorrhaged cash. It was a masterpiece of undeniable evidence. I directed Vince to draft a brief anonymous cover letter. The letter was not to be emotional or vindictive. It was to read like a standard whistleblower disclosure from a concerned internal compliance officer. It simply directed the investors' attention to the attached files, citing the specific paragraphs of their own morality and financial oversight clauses. It warned them that a massive internal audit was imminent, and that their capital was about to be absorbed by existing secret debts. Vince established a secure, untraceable connection through a proxy server located in Eastern Europe. He input the direct email addresses of the 3 senior partners at the San Francisco venture capital firm. These were the men holding the keys to Blake's entire future. They were expecting a pristine cap table and a brilliant innovator. They were about to receive a digital bomb. I stood behind Miles, watching the screen as the encryption sequence finalized. The file contained the absolute destruction of my son's career and the impending criminal indictment of his wife. I felt no hesitation. A man who forces his father out of his own home to hide his insolvency has already made his choice. I gave the order. Miles pressed the final key. The status bar flashed green and the data vanished into the network, rushing silently towards San Francisco. The counterattack was airborne. There was no reversing the transmission. Within the hour, the senior partners would open their inboxes. They would watch Blake lose his mind on camera. They would trace Courtney's fake invoices. Their risk management team would trigger an immediate halt on all pending capital transfers. The funding round that Blake had been relying on to save his sinking company would evaporate before the end of the business day. I walked back to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city. My reputation might suffer a minor dent among local gossips for a few days, but that was irrelevant. The true narrative was about to rewrite itself violently. Blake had sought to publicly shame me, thinking I would cower in the shadows. He had foolishly handed me the exact weapon required to permanently sever his corporate lifelines. My burner phone vibrated on the table. It was not a message from an old friend. It was a secure alert from Vince Navarro. He confirmed that the venture capital servers had received and opened the encrypted files. The tracking pixels embedded in the documents indicated that the files were already being forwarded internally to their legal and compliance departments. The investors were mobilizing. The financial oxygen was officially cut off. The immediate tension shifted. The threat to my personal reputation dissolved into the background, entirely eclipsed by the impending corporate slaughter. Blake was currently preparing to host a lavish party at my estate to celebrate a massive influx of cash that was never going to arrive. He believed he was invincible. He did not know that the ground beneath his feet had just been completely hollowed out. I turned away from the window and instructed Vince to prepare the commercial eviction notice. The digital strike had landed flawlessly, and now it was time to reclaim the physical territory. The rain outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had intensified, but inside the grand foyer of the Seattle estate, the atmosphere was a suffocating wall of artificial heat and expensive perfume. Blake had commissioned a string quartet, their classical arrangements floating above the heavy hum of 50 elite guests. Waiters in pristine black vests glided silently across the imported Persian rugs, balancing silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. This was not merely a social gathering. It was a coronation. Blake stood by the massive marble fireplace holding court among local tech executives and minor celebrities. He was vibrating with a manic, victorious energy. He believed his Series B funding was a locked vault. He believed the old man was rotting in a state-run facility. He believed the kingdom was entirely his. Courtney moved through the crowd with her smartphone raised high, documenting every angle of their triumph. She wore a backless silk gown that cost more than a reliable car, laughing loudly, posing with influential guests, making absolutely certain her digital audience understood the magnitude of her success. She was a queen displaying her spoils. Neither she nor Blake noticed the quiet, persistent buzz of cell phones in the pockets of several key guests. They did not realize that the very venture capitalists they were attempting to court had already frozen their lifelines hours ago. They were dancing on the deck of a sunken ship. Blake raised his crystal flute and tapped it sharply with a silver spoon. The high-pitched ringing cut through the music and the chatter. The string quartet immediately lowered their bows. The room fell into an expectant, breathless silence. Blake smiled a wide, predatory grin that stretched tight across his face. He thanked them all for coming to celebrate the dawn of a new era. He spoke with immense arrogance about vision, about shedding dead weight, and about the absolute necessity of ruthless forward momentum. He did not mention my name, but the implication hung heavy and toxic in the air. He was publicly boasting about my excision. He raised his glass higher, ready to deliver the final triumphant toast to his own genius. "Excuse me, are you Blake Lawson?" The voice did not belong to a tech mogul or a wealthy socialite. It was flat, nasal, and entirely unimpressed. The crowd parted like a receding tide, revealing a man in a damp beige windbreaker standing in the center of the room. He wore scuffed, rubber-soled shoes that were tracking muddy rainwater onto the pristine hardwood. He held a thick, sealed manila envelope in his right hand. Blake lowered his glass, his predatory smile hardening instantly into a mask of pure irritation. He demanded to know who let the man inside and signaled frantically for the private security he had hired for the evening. Courtney immediately lowered her phone, her curated aesthetic momentarily disrupted by the intrusion of this profoundly average-looking stranger. The man did not wait for security. He stepped directly into Blake's personal space. He asked again, clearly and loudly, if he was Blake Lawson. Blake puffed out his chest, attempting to intimidate the intruder with the sheer weight of his assumed authority. He confirmed his identity and demanded the man leave his property immediately. The man did not flinch. He thrust the manila envelope directly into Blake's chest, mirroring the exact physical motion Blake had used against me just days prior. The man stated loudly that Blake was officially served, turned on his rubber-soled shoes, and walked out the front door into the Seattle rain. A suffocating silence blanketed the grand foyer. The elite guests stared at the damp envelope pressed against Blake's expensive, tailored suit. Blake let out a short, forced laugh, attempting to instantly repair the fractured atmosphere. He joked that it was probably a desperate competitor trying to slap him with a frivolous lawsuit before the funding round closed. He commanded the string quartet to resume playing. He confidently tore open the top of the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. He intended to glance at the first page, roll his eyes, and toss it onto the fireplace mantel. Instead, his eyes locked onto the bold, capitalized letters at the top of the page. The blood drained from his face with terrifying speed. His jaw went entirely slack. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble hearth and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. Courtney rushed to his side, her voice tight with genuine panic. She asked him what it was. She reached for the papers, but Blake held them in a death grip, his knuckles turning stark white. He was staring at a commercial eviction notice. It was a formal, non-negotiable mandate ordering him to vacate the premises. He began to stammer. He looked around the room, his eyes wild and uncomprehending. He shouted that this was impossible. He yelled that his name was on the deed, that he owned this estate, and that this was a fraudulent document. His voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, entirely devoid of its former arrogance. It was the sound of a man plummeting through thin air. He was wrong. He had always been wrong. When I purchased the multi-million-dollar estate 5 years ago, I did not place the property in his name. I placed it in the name of a private holding company. I gave him a minority non-voting share of that company to satisfy his ego and allow him to boast at cocktail parties. I never transferred the controlling shares. I retained absolute dictatorial control over the holding company, and by extension, the dirt beneath his feet. He had lived in my house, slept under my roof, and hosted his lavish parties on my property, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was nothing more than a glorified tenant. Courtney snatched the papers from his rigid hands. She scanned the legal jargon, her eyes darting frantically across the pages. She read the stipulations out loud, her voice rising in pitch until it bordered on a hysterical shriek. The holding company had not just filed an eviction notice. I had executed a total, irreversible liquidation of the asset. The document clearly stated that the entire estate had been sold in a private all-cash transaction to a commercial land developer. The developer had already secured the municipal permits for demolition. They were going to bulldoze the multi-million-dollar mansion, tear up the manicured lawns, and pave over the footprint to build a block of high-density, budget-friendly townhouses. I was erasing the physical monument to his arrogance from the face of the earth. Courtney dropped the papers onto the floor as if they were burning her fingers. She looked at Blake, her perfectly contoured face contorted into a mask of absolute horror. She screamed at him, demanding to know how he could let this happen. She screamed that he told her he owned the property free and clear. She realized in real time that the wealthy, invincible tech founder she had married was an illusion, a house of cards constructed on a foundation I had just completely removed. Blake fell to his knees on the Persian rug, scrambling to gather the scattered pages. He read the final paragraph, the absolute deadline. 14 days. The commercial developer required immediate vacant possession to begin the demolition process. Blake and Courtney had exactly 14 days to remove their designer furniture, their expensive wardrobes, and their entire lives from the premises. There were no extensions. There was no appeals process. The sale was final, the funds were transferred, and the legal machinery was already grinding forward with unstoppable mechanical force. The elite guests, the venture capitalists, and the minor celebrities did not offer their support. They recognized a toxic asset when they saw one. The room emptied with ruthless efficiency. The caterers stopped serving. The string quartet packed their instruments and fled. Within 10 minutes, the grand foyer was entirely deserted, save for Blake kneeling in the center of the rug, clutching the eviction notice, and Courtney standing over him, weeping tears of pure, unadulterated panic. The heavy glass windows of my downtown hotel suite offered a perfect vantage point over the Seattle skyline. I stood with my hands clasped firmly behind my back, watching the relentless rain wash over the financial district. Down there, among the glowing towers of glass and steel, my son was experiencing the total collapse of his carefully constructed universe. The digital strike had landed with devastating precision, and the commercial eviction notice had successfully severed his physical anchor. I knew the exact sequence of events that would inevitably follow. A structure built entirely on a foundation of deceit cannot slowly settle when the load-bearing pillars are removed. It violently shatters, and the resulting debris always follows the path of least resistance. I knew Blake would come looking for me. The quiet hum of the climate control in the room was suddenly broken by a violent rhythmic pounding against the heavy oak door of the suite. It was not a polite knock or a request for entry. It was the frantic, aggressive hammering of a man who had completely lost control of his emotional faculties. I did not rush. I walked across the plush carpet with the steady, measured pace of a man who holds absolutely all the cards. I reached out and unlatched the deadbolt, pulling the heavy door wide open. Blake lunged into the room like a cornered animal. He was completely drenched from the storm outside. His expensive custom-tailored suit was plastered to his skin and completely ruined by the downpour and his own nervous sweat. His hair was matted to his forehead, and his eyes were wild, bloodshot, and wide with absolute panic. The arrogant, untouchable tech visionary who had stood in my dining room just days prior, jabbing his finger into my chest and calling me a parasite, was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, frantic child throwing a destructive tantrum, because his illusion of power had been stripped away. He slammed the door shut behind him and immediately began screaming. He demanded to know what I had done to him. He paced the floor of my suite like a caged predator, throwing his arms wildly into the air. He yelled that his funding round was dead and that the venture capitalists from San Francisco had completely frozen all communication and pulled their capital. He screamed about the eviction notice, crying that his celebration was ruined and that his elite investors had abandoned him in the middle of his own living room. He accused me of being a bitter, jealous old man who could not stand to see his own flesh and blood achieve greatness. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room and let his rage wash completely over me. I did not interrupt him. I did not offer any defense or explanation. An engineer does not argue with a collapsing building. He simply steps back and observes the failure of the materials. Blake swept his arm across a small side table, knocking a decorative glass vase to the floor. It shattered into dozens of sharp pieces against the hardwood, but I did not even blink. My total silence only fueled his absolute hysteria. He closed the distance between us, storming into my personal space until we were mere inches apart. He tried to use his height and his physical presence to intimidate me, just as he had done in the dining room. He lowered his voice into a vicious, guttural growl and told me I was going to fix this. He demanded that I call the commercial developers and cancel the sale of the estate. He ordered me to contact the venture capitalists and tell them the financial documents they received were a total lie. He told me that if I did not restore his life to exactly the way it was, he was going to destroy me physically and permanently. To emphasize his threat, Blake raised his right hand. He curled his fingers into a tight, white-knuckled fist and pulled his arm back, preparing to strike me directly in the face. The physical violence was the absolute last resort of a man who had entirely run out of leverage and intellect. I did not raise my hands to protect myself. I did not take a single step back in fear. I looked directly into his furious eyes, and I simply shifted my weight, stepping smoothly to my left. By moving aside, I completely removed the physical barrier between Blake and the shadowed corner of the hotel suite. Standing there perfectly motionless against the patterned wallpaper was Miles Decker. My private investigator held a high-definition digital camera gripped firmly in both hands. The lens was pointed directly at Blake's face, and a small red light blinked with a steady, merciless rhythm, indicating that the entire violent interaction was being recorded in pristine quality. Blake froze instantly. His fist hovered uselessly in midair. The adrenaline draining from his system was almost visible as the color vanished entirely from his face. He stared at the blinking red light and the grim, unyielding expression hewn on the investigator's face. The mathematical reality of his situation crashed down upon him with staggering force. If he followed through with his swing, if he even laid a single finger on my clothing, he would not merely be a bankrupt and evicted fraud. He would be facing felony assault charges, fully documented and ready for immediate prosecution. His arm slowly dropped to his side. The aggressive posture dissolved, leaving him slumped and trembling in the center of the room. The hunter had suddenly realized he was standing directly on the trapdoor. I turned my back on his pathetic display and walked toward the heavy mahogany desk resting near the window. I reached down and picked up a single crisp document that my corporate attorney had prepared for me earlier that afternoon. I walked back toward Blake and slid the paper across the smooth surface of the table until it came to a rest directly in front of him. I broke my silence. My voice was calm, cold, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I told him that the piece of paper he stole from my floor, safe in the middle of the night, was nothing but a worthless duplicate. I explained the mechanics of his failure in excruciating detail so he would understand exactly how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. I told him that 3 years ago, when he came to me begging for the seed capital to save his failing startup, my attorney did not just lock the physical promissory note in a metal box. I explained that a notarized, tamper-proof digital copy of that exact convertible debt note had been filed directly with the Securities and Exchange Commission under a blind corporate registry. I watched his eyes widen in sheer horror as the gravity of his actions finally registered in his panicking brain. I told him that he had committed federal wire fraud and destroyed my personal property for absolutely no reason. He had stolen a meaningless souvenir while the actual weapon remained safely locked in the impenetrable vaults of the federal government. I pointed to the document resting on the table. I instructed him to read the bold lettering across the top of the page. It was the formal, legally binding execution of the equity conversion. I explained that by actively soliciting Series B venture capital while attempting to conceal my majority stake and force me into a psychiatric facility, he had triggered the exact clause required for me to act. The debt had officially converted. I did not raise my voice, but every single word I spoke struck him with the force of a wrecking ball. I told him that as of this very second, I officially owned 51% of his entire startup. I held the controlling majority. I was the absolute singular authority over the company he claimed to have built. I made sure he understood that his company was no longer his kingdom. I detailed how his frantic spending and his wife's ongoing embezzlement had already doomed the enterprise, but his attempt to defraud his investors and his own father was the fatal blow. I explained that the venture capitalists who had frozen his funding did not just receive a video of his temper tantrum. They received a complete and thorough audit of his corporate accounts, exposing the dummy corporations and the stolen funds Courtney used to pay for designer bags and luxury vacations. I watched the realization wash over him that his wife was not just a liability, but an active criminal who had helped dig his grave. Blake opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He gasped for air, looking frantically between the legal document on the table, the blinking red light of the camera in the corner, and my entirely unforgiving face. He was suffocating under the immense crushing weight of his own hubris. The son who had looked me in the eye and called me a parasite was now standing in a puddle of his own making, completely stripped of his armor and his assets. I looked at him and delivered the final surgical strike. I told him that as the majority shareholder and the new controlling executive of the corporation, my very first official action was to terminate his employment. I told him to step away from the table because he no longer had any authority to speak on behalf of the company, to access its servers, or to enter its premises. I informed him that my security team would be waiting at the corporate office to escort him out if he even attempted to badge in. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he was fired effective immediately. I instructed him to turn around and walk out of my hotel room before I allowed my investigator to hand the camera footage directly over to the local police department. I watched my son, broken and utterly defeated, turn around and walk slowly back out the door into the cold Seattle rain. Courtney sat perfectly still in the stark white light of the executive suite. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seattle storm lashed violently against the reinforced glass, but inside the corporate headquarters, the silence was absolute and suffocating. She had abandoned Blake the moment he sent a frantic, chaotic text message from the hotel lobby, stating that his father had somehow ruined everything. She did not care about Blake's emotional state or his shattered relationship with his father. She cared exclusively about the $6.2 million sitting in the company operating account. She had raced her luxury vehicle through the slick city streets, running 2 red lights to reach the office building before the banks closed for the day. She slid into Blake's massive leather chair and forcefully tapped the keyboard of his primary desktop computer, waking the dual monitors from their sleep state. Her perfectly manicured fingers flew across the keys with desperate precision. She navigated directly to the secure corporate banking portal. She typed in the executive administrative credentials that Blake had foolishly entrusted to her months ago, when he was too overwhelmed by investor meetings to handle the daily payroll. She needed to move the cash immediately. Her plan was surgically simple and ruthlessly efficient. She would drain the remaining liquid capital, route the entire sum through the 3 dummy vendor corporations she secretly controlled, and transfer the money into a decentralized offshore crypto wallet. She would vanish with the treasury before the old man or his vicious lawyers could officially seize the corporate reins. She pressed the enter key and waited for the familiar dashboard to load. A gray loading circle spun in the center of the screen. Courtney held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The circle froze. The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding white. Then a solid crimson banner slammed across the digital interface. The text was stark and unforgiving. Access denied. Administrative privileges revoked by primary shareholder. Courtney slammed her open palms against the glass surface of the desk. The sharp crack echoed through the empty office. She gritted her teeth and clicked the refresh button. She typed the password again, slower this time, pressing each key with deliberate force. The screen mocked her with the exact same crimson banner. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar sensation, began to claw at the edges of her mind. She opened a new tab and tried to access the secondary payroll accounts. Locked. She tried to log into the encrypted corporate server to delete the history of her dummy invoices. The connection timed out entirely. Kenneth Lawson was already inside the system. He had not just fired his son. He had systematically bolted every digital door and seized the entire treasury. The heavy glass door of the executive suite suddenly swung open. Blake stumbled into the room. He was a catastrophic sight. His bespoke suit was saturated with cold rainwater and clinging uselessly to his shivering frame. His tie was pulled loose and his hair was matted to his forehead. He looked entirely hollowed out, as if the structural integrity of his very skeleton had collapsed. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, gasping for air. He looked at Courtney with wild, desperate eyes, expecting comfort or perhaps a brilliant tactical strategy. He found neither. Courtney stood up and stared at him with absolute, unvarnished disgust. She did not ask if he was all right. She demanded to know what happened at the hotel and why the corporate accounts were completely frozen. Blake pushed himself away from the doorframe and practically collapsed onto the leather sofa in the corner of the office. He buried his face in his trembling hands. He croaked that his father had a digitized, notarized copy of the convertible note. He explained that the physical paper in the floor safe meant absolutely nothing. He ran his hands through his wet hair and whispered that his father now owned 51% of the company and that the venture capitalists from San Francisco had pulled their funding. He looked up at her with tears mixing with the rain on his face. He said his father had fired him and that the federal authorities were likely already building a wire fraud case. He whimpered that they had lost everything. Courtney did not rush across the room to console him. The carefully curated facade of the supportive, loving tech wife instantly shattered, revealing the ruthless mercenary calculating her odds of survival. She marched around the desk and pointed a shaking finger directly at his face. She screamed that he was a pathetic, incompetent failure. She reminded him of the explicit promises he made when they married. He promised her an empire. He promised her absolute financial immunity and a life of untouchable luxury. She yelled that she had spent years building an aesthetic, an entire personal brand based on his supposed genius, and he had thrown it all away because he was too stupid and arrogant to check the legal status of a single loan from his own father. Blake stared at her. The sheer venom in her voice pierced through his paralyzing fear. He asked her how she could be so incredibly cold. He reminded her that his own father had just destroyed him, that the commercial developers were bulldozing their home, and that they were about to be sleeping on the street. Courtney laughed, a harsh grating sound that bounced off the glass walls. She told him she did not care about his emotional trauma or his daddy issues. She stated she only cared about the money she was owed. She paced the room like a caged animal, her mind racing through the shifting variables. She realized Blake was entirely paralyzed by his defeat. He was absolutely useless to her survival. She knew she had to cut him loose and save herself. She looked at the heavy multi-line corporate phone resting on the desk. If Kenneth Lawson was controlling the company, he had to be using a proxy. He had to be using the corporate attorney who set the digital trap. She snatched the handset from the cradle. She bypassed the standard external lines and dialed the direct internal extension for the chief legal officer. She knew the company lawyers were historically spineless and accustomed to bowing to aggressive executive demands. She expected to hear a frightened junior partner she could easily manipulate or bribe into unfreezing a single offshore account. The line clicked and connected. A voice answered. It was not a junior partner. The voice was deep resonant and carried the chilling, absolute authority of an apex predator. Vincent Navarro announced his name and stated he was currently acting as the interim chief executive officer of the corporation on behalf of the majority shareholder, Kenneth Lawson. Courtney froze. She recognized the name from the society pages. Navarro was a legal butcher, a man who dismantled corporations for sport. She knew he had seized the corporate treasury and locked the gates. But she was desperate, and desperation breeds extreme recklessness. She gripped the phone tightly and tried to project the commanding, untouchable authority she utilized to bully public relations agencies and brand sponsors. She told Vince to listen to her very carefully. She stated she was sitting in the executive suite, and she possessed immediate physical access to the primary servers. She claimed she could wipe the proprietary source code, delete the massive client databases, and permanently salt the earth of the company before he could send building security up the elevator. She demanded a severance package, a golden parachute of $2 million transferred to a neutral account, in exchange for her walking away quietly and leaving the servers intact. Vince Navarro did not sound alarmed. He sounded mildly bored. He invited her to try. He informed her that the primary servers had been cloned and isolated to an off-site secure location an hour ago. He explained that the terminal she was currently using was completely quarantined and disconnected from the intranet. He stated she was shouting threats from inside a digital sandbox. Courtney felt the walls of the glass office rapidly closing in. The leverage she thought she held was nothing but smoke. She looked at Blake, who was still sitting on the sofa, watching her with a blank, terrified expression. She made a split-second decision to completely sever her ties to her husband and save herself at any cost. She shifted her tone from aggressive hostility to conspiratorial negotiation. She told Vince they did not need to fight. She said she understood how the game was played, and she was willing to make a mutually beneficial arrangement. She offered him a deal. She told him she knew Blake was going down for federal wire fraud regarding the venture capital funding. She stated she could provide testimony that Blake was mentally unstable, abusive, and entirely responsible for the corporate collapse. Vince remained perfectly silent, forcing her to fill the uncomfortable void. Courtney took the bait. She began to speak rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, desperate rush. She confessed that Blake was completely insolvent and had been lying to the board for a year. But she went further. She decided to use her own hidden actions as a bargaining chip, believing her insider knowledge was a highly valuable commodity. She told Vince that she controlled 3 separate dummy vendor accounts under different LLCs. She admitted that she had been routing venture capital funds through those accounts for the past 24 months to bypass the board of directors' oversight. She stated clearly and proudly that she had successfully extracted over $700,000 from the operating budget to keep the company from seizing it. She heard Blake gasp loudly from the sofa, but she ignored him completely. She was negotiating for her life. She told Vince she had the exact ledgers, the routing numbers, and the passwords. She proposed a compromise. She would return exactly 50% of the extracted funds to the corporate treasury immediately. In exchange, she demanded that Vince grant her a full legal release, a silent exit from the company, and an ironclad guarantee that Kenneth Lawson would not pursue criminal charges against her. She blamed Blake entirely, stating he forced her to create the dummy corporations to hide his own massive financial incompetence from his father. She finished her desperate pitch and waited, breathing heavily into the receiver. Vincent Navarro let the silence stretch for 10 agonizing seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of mercy or negotiation. He told her that her proposal was rejected. Courtney demanded to know why. She shouted that she was handing him hundreds of thousands of dollars on a silver platter. She yelled that he was an absolute fool to turn down guaranteed cash when the company was already bleeding out. Vince replied that he was not turning down anything. He explained that his forensic accounting team, led by Miles Decker, had already identified the 3 dummy corporations hours ago. He stated they had traced the funds directly to her personal credit card accounts. He informed her he did not need her ledgers because he already possessed the exact bank statements, proving she had used stolen corporate funds to pay for designer clothes and luxury vacations. He told her she had stolen from a company that was now 51% owned by his client. Courtney felt the blood drain entirely from her face. She gripped the edge of the glass desk, trying to steady her violently trembling legs. She stammered that they could still make a deal. She pleaded that she was willing to return all the money, every single penny, if he just let her walk away without calling the police. Vince Navarro delivered the fatal blow with surgical precision. He informed her that Kenneth Lawson had issued a new executive directive the exact moment he took control of the company. Vince explained that to ensure total transparency during the hostile takeover, all internal corporate communication lines had been switched to a mandatory recording protocol. He stated that every single word she had spoken since dialing his extension was captured on an encrypted hard drive. Courtney stopped breathing. She stared at the black plastic handset in her hand, as if it had transformed into a venomous snake. Vince continued, his voice ringing with absolute finality. He told her that because the company was currently undergoing a massive internal audit, triggered by Blake's fraudulent attempt to secure venture capital, federal authorities were already highly involved. He stated clearly that the specific corporate line she was currently speaking on had been patched directly to a live monitoring team at the Federal Fraud Division. He told her that federal investigators had just listened to her explicitly confess to corporate embezzlement, grand larceny, and wire fraud. He informed her that they had heard her detail the exact mechanics of her dummy corporations and attempt to extort the company for legal immunity. He told her she had just handed the federal government a pristine, voluntary, and fully recorded confession. Courtney dropped the phone. It hit the glass desk with a sharp crack and clattered to the floor, dragging the coiled cord behind it. She stood completely paralyzed, staring at the device. The intricate, impenetrable house of cards she had spent years building had not just collapsed. It had been pulverized into dust. She looked at Blake. He was staring at her with an expression of sheer horror, finally realizing that the woman he married had secretly bled his company dry and then handed the murder weapon directly to the authorities. They were trapped in the glass office, surrounded by the ruins of their arrogance, waiting for the inevitable sound of sirens. The climate-controlled air inside the executive boardroom was entirely sterile, offering no comfort to the 7 men and women seated around the massive mahogany table. Outside the wraparound glass walls, the Seattle storm continued to rage, casting long, weeping shadows across the polished floor. Blake stood at the head of the table, gripping the edges of the wood so tightly his knuckles were completely drained of color. His custom-tailored suit was still damp and horribly wrinkled from his frantic sprint through the rain, and his hair, usually styled with effortless precision, hung in chaotic strands across his forehead. He was fighting for his corporate life, desperately trying to rally the minority shareholders and early angel investors to block the hostile takeover that was currently suffocating his company. Blake was delivering the performance of a lifetime, weaving a tragic and entirely fabricated narrative. He lowered his voice, injecting a tone of profound, heartbreaking sorrow into his words. He told the board members that his father was a deeply troubled man, a tragic victim of rapid-onset dementia and severe paranoia. He paced the length of the room, looking each investor in the eye, claiming that the hostile equity conversion they were currently panicking over was nothing more than the delusion of a sick elderly mind. He swore to them that he had already executed a medical power of attorney out of sheer necessity, stepping in to protect his father's remaining assets from his own erratic behavior. Blake raised his hands in a gesture of defensive surrender, insisting that the SEC filing was a catastrophic clerical error, a forged document pushed through by a predatory lawyer taking advantage of a senile old man. He begged the board to stand united. He promised them that if they just held the line and blocked the transfer of power, the Series B funding from San Francisco would clear by the end of the week, saving all of their equity and propelling the company into the stratosphere. He was incredibly persuasive, tapping into their deepest fears of losing their massive investments. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their expensive ergonomic chairs. They wanted to believe him. Believing Blake meant their money was safe. Acknowledging that the founder of the company was a fraud meant admitting that their own rigorous due diligence had completely failed. A tense, fragile consensus began to form in the room. They were preparing to vote in Blake's favor, preparing to initiate a legal blockade against the takeover. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom suddenly swung open, gliding silently on their brushed steel hinges. The conversation died instantly. I stepped into the room. I was not wearing the damp, moth-eaten sweater Blake had mocked so viciously at the family dinner. I wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an absolute unyielding blank canvas. Vincent Navarro walked half a step behind me carrying a sleek leather portfolio. We did not look like a confused elderly man and a predatory lawyer. We looked like an execution squad. Blake stopped breathing. He backed away from the head of the table, his spine hitting the glass wall overlooking the city. He pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know how I had bypassed building security. He ordered the executive assistant cowering in the corner to call the police immediately, shouting that I was a trespasser and a legally incapacitated ward of the state. I ignored his hysterical outburst entirely. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of anger. I walked slowly to the opposite end of the mahogany table, commanding the absolute attention of every single investor in the room. I spoke softly, forcing the board members to hold their breath and lean forward just to hear my words. I introduced myself not as Blake's father, but as the owner of 51% of the voting shares of the corporation. Blake shrieked that I was lying. He slammed his hand against the glass wall, screaming to the board that I was suffering from a psychotic break. He frantically reminded them of the power of attorney, declaring that I had absolutely no legal authority to speak, let alone commandeer a corporate meeting. I turned my head and looked directly at the lead investor, a stern, silver-haired venture capitalist who held the largest minority stake in the room. I reached my hand out, and Vince Navarro silently placed a thick, bound folder into my palm. I dropped the first file onto the mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I slid it down the polished surface until it came to a rest directly in front of the lead investor. I explained with the cold precision of an engineer diagnosing a structural failure that the document they were looking at was a comprehensive certified psychiatric and cognitive evaluation. I informed the board that I had subjected myself to a rigorous battery of neurological testing by the chief of medicine at Seattle Grace Hospital just 24 hours ago. I stated clearly that my mental acuity scored in the 99th percentile for a man of any age. I then revealed the drip-fed truth about the medical directive Blake was so desperately clinging to. I explained that it was a temporary 2-week surgical proxy I had signed 3 years ago, a document my son had criminally altered and submitted to a judge under penalty of perjury. I told the board that the power of attorney was a confirmed forgery, and my medical clearance was absolute. The lead investor opened the file. He read the chief of medicine's summary, tracing the official hospital seals with his index finger. He slowly looked up from the page, his eyes shifting from the certified document to Blake's sweating, panic-stricken face. The illusion of the tragic, loving son instantly shattered. Blake began to stammer, his voice dropping into a desperate, high-pitched whine. He took a step away from the glass wall, raising his hands, attempting to pivot his lies. He tried to claim that the medical evaluation was purchased, that Vince had bribed a doctor to clear my name, and that the company was still financially invincible. He swore that the San Francisco money was practically in their bank accounts. I reached out my hand again. Vince placed a second, vastly thicker file into my palm. I dropped it onto the table. I announced that this was a fully reconciled forensic audit of the corporate treasury conducted by an independent financial intelligence firm over the past 12 hours. I looked around the room, making eye contact with every single shareholder. I told them they had been systematically lied to for 18 months. I detailed the astronomical burn rate, the millions of dollars wasted on vanity marketing, and the staggering mountain of unpaid vendor invoices Blake had hidden in shadow ledgers. I stated with absolute undeniable clarity that the company was completely insolvent. I explained that Blake had been operating a ghost ship, masking the total financial decay of the infrastructure to secure their venture capital under entirely false pretenses. The board members scrambled out of their chairs, crowding around the lead investor to look at the spreadsheets. The columns of red ink were catastrophic. The financial ruin was laid bare under the bright fluorescent lights of the boardroom. The venture capitalists realized in real time that their equity was currently worthless and that they had been backing a catastrophic fraud. Blake was hyperventilating. He clutched his chest, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. He realized he was trapped. He tried to speak, attempting to formulate a sentence about cash flow shortages and temporary market hurdles, but his voice cracked into a pathetic, breathless wheeze. He was completely out of ammunition. I pulled the final thinnest file from Vince's portfolio. I did not drop this one. I placed it gently, almost reverently, onto the center of the table. I announced that this was a federal subpoena. I told the paralyzed board of directors that Courtney Blake's wife had been operating 3 dummy vendor corporations for the past 2 years. I explained that she had been systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from the company operating budget to fund her personal credit cards and maintain a fictional digital lifestyle. I watched Blake's knees physically buckle. He grabbed the back of his chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor. I delivered the final devastating escalation. I informed the board that just 1 hour ago, Courtney had called the corporate legal department in a panicked attempt to extort a severance package. I revealed that she had voluntarily confessed to the entire embezzlement scheme, completely unaware that the internal corporate lines had been patched directly to a live monitoring team at the Federal Fraud Division. I stated clearly that Blake was not merely an incompetent and failed chief executive. He and his wife were the primary targets of an active, escalating federal wire fraud investigation. The reaction was instantaneous. The board members physically recoiled from the table. They pushed their chairs backward, scrambling away from Blake as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. They realized that any association with him from this second forward carried massive federal liability. The lead investor closed the files, adjusted his suit jacket, and turned his back entirely on my son. He looked directly at me, acknowledging the undisputed transfer of power, and asked for my immediate instructions. The board had completely and totally abandoned Blake. I turned my head and looked at the broken, shivering man clutching the back of the leather chair. The son who had publicly humiliated me, who had called me a parasite in front of our family, was now entirely alone, stripped of his title, his company, and his future. I did not smile. I simply told him that the emergency meeting was adjourned, and so was his career. 2 massive men in dark tactical uniforms flanked Blake as they walked down the long corridor of the executive floor. These were the exact same private security guards Blake had personally authorized to hire just 3 months ago to protect his corporate secrets. Now their heavy hands gripped his upper arms with a firm and professional detachment. Blake stumbled over his own feet, dragging his expensive leather shoes against the polished concrete. He demanded they let go of him, but his voice lacked any actual authority. The open floor plan of the office offered absolutely no privacy. Dozens of software engineers, data analysts, and marketing directors paused their furious typing. They stood up from their ergonomic chairs and watched in absolute stunned silence as their founder and former chief executive was physically removed from the premises. Blake tried to maintain some pathetic semblance of dignity. He straightened his shoulders and attempted to glare at the whispering employees, but his damp suit and violently trembling jaw completely betrayed him. He was a defeated, broken man being marched directly to the gallows. The security guards did not speak a single word to him. They escorted him to the private executive elevator. They swiped a security keycard that Blake himself had programmed and authorized. The steel doors slid open, and they pushed him roughly inside. The descent to the ground floor took exactly 40 seconds. For Blake, those 40 seconds were a suffocating, agonizing eternity. He stared at the brushed metal walls. He realized that Courtney was still upstairs, likely surrounded by federal agents, or furiously negotiating her own immunity. He was entirely isolated and completely ruined. When the elevator reached the lobby, the guards marched him past the main reception desk. The receptionist, a young woman Blake usually ignored completely, watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. The guards pushed open the heavy glass revolving doors. The violent Seattle storm immediately swallowed Blake. The freezing rain hit his face like a shower of icy needles. The guards stepped back inside the dry, warmly lit lobby and locked the doors from the inside. Blake turned around and placed his bare hands against the wet glass. He was permanently locked out of his own empire. He stumbled backward into the flooded corporate parking lot. The deep water soaked through his expensive shoes, instantly chilling his feet to the bone. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting pale yellow reflections across the black, muddy asphalt. He had no car. Courtney had driven them in her luxury vehicle, and he knew with absolute certainty she would never let him inside it again. He had no active corporate credit card to call a private transport. He pulled his personal cellular phone from his pocket. The screen was completely black, bricked by the information technology department the very second the board meeting adjourned. He was a multimillionaire on paper who suddenly possessed zero physical assets and zero means of communication. He shivered violently, pulling the lapels of his ruined suit jacket together. The freezing reality of his total annihilation began to paralyze his nervous system. The venture capital was gone. The estate was sold. The company was completely out of his control. His wife had actively embezzled his operating funds and handed a recorded confession to the federal government. He had absolutely nowhere to go and no one to call. He looked across the expansive parking lot and spotted a long black town car idling near the underground exit. The bright headlights cut sharply through the heavy sheets of rain. He knew that specific car. He had seen it parked in the circular driveway of his estate on the day he tried to force his father to sign the fraudulent medical proxy. It was my vehicle. Blake realized his father was still inside the building, finalizing the complete destruction of his life and transferring the corporate assets. A new wave of desperate, frantic energy flooded Blake's veins. He could not run away into the city. He had to stay. He had to beg. He walked toward the idling town car and waited in the freezing downpour like a starving stray animal. I stepped out of the private secure elevator onto the subterranean parking level. Miles Decker walked silently beside me, his digital camera secured safely inside a waterproof tactical bag. The air in the concrete garage was thick with the smell of exhaust and damp earth. We walked toward the black town car waiting by the exit ramp. The driver stepped out and opened the heavy rear door, holding a large black umbrella to shield me from the incoming storm. I did not feel any triumphant joy. I did not feel the intoxicating rush of petty vengeance. I felt nothing but the profound, hollow satisfaction of a structural engineer who has successfully demolished a condemned, unstable building before it could collapse and kill innocent bystanders. I had neutralized a catastrophic, toxic threat to my own survival. I buttoned my wool coat and prepared to step into the warm vehicle. A sudden erratic movement in the dark shadows caught my attention. Blake emerged from the heavy curtain of rain. He was sprinting across the wet asphalt, slipping and sliding dangerously in his ruined dress shoes. He looked exactly like a drowning man thrashing desperately toward a piece of floating driftwood. He threw himself violently at the side of the town car. He slammed his bare, muddy hands against the passenger side window, leaving thick, dirty streaks across the dark, tinted glass. He screamed my name. His voice was hoarse, desperate, and completely broken by the raging storm. I paused with one foot inside the vehicle. The professional driver immediately dropped the umbrella and moved to physically intercept him, but I raised my hand. I silently instructed the driver to stand down and return to the wheel. I slid into the back leather seat, closed the door, and looked through the glass at the man I had raised from infancy. Blake pressed his wet face against the cold window. He was weeping uncontrollably. Thick, heavy tears mixed with the rainwater pouring down his pale cheeks. He slapped the glass again, begging me to roll the window down. He yelled that he was incredibly sorry for everything. He cried out that he had lost absolutely everything in the span of a single hour. He screamed that Courtney was leaving him and blaming him for the fraud. He yelled that the federal agents were going to arrest him before morning and that the commercial developers were going to bulldoze his home in exactly 14 days. He pleaded for absolute mercy using the only remaining leverage he thought he possessed. He screamed about our shared blood. He cried out that I was his father and he was my only son. He sobbed loudly that family was supposed to forgive each other no matter what terrible things happened. He demanded that I remember all the years we spent together building a life. He reminded me of the time I stayed up all night helping him build his first computer in the garage. He reminded me of the small initial loan I gave him to start his very first business when no bank would even look at his application. He used those specific precious memories as a blunt weapon, trying to twist my own past generosity into a mandatory obligation to save him from his current disaster. He yelled that a father does not financially destroy his own son. I sat perfectly still in the comfortable dry leather seat of the town car and watched him completely unravel. I remembered that initial loan perfectly. I remembered working brutal 80-hour weeks inspecting cracked foundations and failing commercial bridges just to save enough excess capital to give him a massive head start in life. I remembered how he took that money and never once offered a single genuine word of gratitude. I remembered how he rewarded decades of my silent, unyielding sacrifice by forging medical documents and attempting to lock me inside a sterile psychiatric ward so he could liquidate my remaining assets and fund his lavish parties. I reached over and pressed the button on the polished door panel. The electric motor hummed quietly, and the tinted glass slowly rolled down halfway, letting the freezing Seattle rain blow directly into the pristine cabin. Blake immediately stopped slapping the glass. He gripped the wet edge of the open window with both hands, his knuckles stark white and shaking violently. He gasped for air, thanking me profusely over and over again. He started to stammer out a frantic promise to pay me back every single penny, with massive interest, if I just called the corporate lawyers and stopped the hostile takeover. I did not let him finish his pathetic, frantic sentence. I looked directly into his bloodshot, terrified eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level, steady, and entirely devoid of any emotional warmth or parental affection. I told him that he had looked me directly in the eye inside my own dining room and called me a parasite. I reminded him that he had stood proudly in front of his wife and declared that I was a pathetic, dependent organism constantly draining his valuable resources. Blake tried to interrupt violently, shaking his head and crying out that he did not mean it. He sobbed loudly that he was just angry and severely stressed about closing the venture capital funding round. I completely ignored his desperate apologies. I continued my thought with absolute merciless clarity. I told him that a parasite feeds off a living host until the host is completely dead and drained of all nutrients. I watched his face pale as the true meaning of my words began to penetrate his panicking mind. I told him that for his entire adult life he had fundamentally misunderstood the basic dynamic of our relationship. He had arrogantly assumed he was the powerful, wealthy provider, and I was the weak, dependent burden holding him back. I leaned slightly closer to the open window, letting the cold rain hit my face. I told him that he had just discovered exactly who the host truly was. I did not wait for any response. I did not wait for him to cognitively process the absolute devastation of that factual statement. I pressed the button on the door panel. The electric motor hummed again. The tinted glass rolled up smoothly, forcing Blake to snatch his hands away before his fingers were crushed into the frame. I looked straight ahead and instructed the driver to take me back to the downtown hotel. The heavy, powerful engine of the town car roared to life. The vehicle pulled away from the wet curb, merging seamlessly into the dark, flooded streets of the financial district. I did not look back a single time in the rearview mirror. I left my son standing entirely alone in the freezing rain, surrounded by the total, absolute ruins of his own unforgivable arrogance. The pristine glass walls of the downtown Seattle legal district offered absolutely no protection from the brutal reality of the federal justice system. Courtney sat on a rigid leather sofa in the reception area of a top-tier criminal defense firm. She was no longer wearing her backless silk gowns or her designer accessories. She wore a subdued gray blazer and oversized dark sunglasses, attempting to project the image of a traumatized victim rather than a calculating corporate embezzler. Her manicured fingers trembled violently as she clutched a thick manila folder against her chest. Inside that folder was the formal indictment from the Federal Fraud Division. The document detailed every single illicit transfer, every dummy corporation, and every stolen dollar she had routed into her offshore crypto wallets. The federal government did not offer polite warnings. They offered absolute annihilation. Courtney had not slept for 3 days. The moment she realized Vincent Navarro had recorded her confession and handed it directly to the authorities, her entire universe fractured. She knew the federal prosecutors possessed an airtight case. They had her digital signature on the bank transfers. They had the routing numbers, and they had her own voice explicitly detailing the mechanics of her grand larceny. She knew she was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Her only remaining strategy was total, ruthless self-preservation. She was prepared to sacrifice her husband without a single second of hesitation. She was ushered into a sterile conference room by a senior defense attorney. She sat across from him and immediately began weaving a complex, fabricated narrative of coercion and emotional abuse. She told the lawyer that she was a terrified captive wife. She claimed that Blake was a manic, controlling tyrant who forced her to sign the incorporation documents for the dummy vendors. She stated that he held her hostage within their marriage, threatening to destroy her completely if she did not help him hide his massive financial incompetence from the board of directors and from his father. She offered to turn state evidence. She offered to stand in front of a federal judge and testify that Blake orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme to cover his own catastrophic failures. She was trading Blake's freedom for her own immunity. She did not realize that the legal universe is incredibly small and deeply interconnected. Blake was currently spiraling through his own waking nightmare. He had been locked out of his company, evicted from his home, and abandoned by his venture capitalists. He knew the federal authorities were closing in, and he desperately needed aggressive criminal representation. He had frantically called old college friends and former board members begging for a referral. They had directed him to the exact same high-powered defense firm Courtney had chosen. Blake stumbled through the heavy glass doors of the reception area just as Courtney and her attorney emerged from the conference room. The collision was inevitable and utterly devastating. Blake froze on the polished marble floor. He stared at his wife. He saw the thick legal folder in her hands and the calculating defensive posture of the attorney standing beside her. The remnants of his arrogance evaporated instantly, replaced by a sudden, horrific understanding. He approached her, his voice trembling with a mixture of betrayal and absolute panic. He asked her what she was doing in this building. He asked her if she was speaking to the federal prosecutors. Courtney did not flinch. She did not offer him a comforting embrace or a promise of marital solidarity. She pulled her dark sunglasses down and looked at the man she had married with pure, unadulterated contempt. She told him that she was surviving. She stated clearly and loudly in the middle of the crowded lobby that she was not going to spend the best years of her life rotting in a federal prison cell because he was too incompetent to run a profitable tech company. She told him that she had accepted a plea deal. She informed him that she had given the prosecutors everything they needed to lock him away for a very long time. The lobby of the law firm descended into absolute chaos. Blake completely lost whatever fragile grip he still held on his sanity. He screamed at her. His voice echoed off the marble walls, bouncing through the quiet corridors of the legal offices. He yelled that she was a thief and a parasite. He reminded her that she was the one who stole the money to buy luxury handbags and fund their lavish lifestyle while he was desperately trying to keep the company afloat. He accused her of ruining his life, destroying his relationship with his father, and turning him into a federal criminal. Courtney screamed right back at him. She did not lower her voice or attempt to maintain any sense of public dignity. She told him he was a pathetic, weak coward who needed his father to fund his dreams and needed her to cover up his failures. She yelled that he had promised her an empire and delivered nothing but a collapsing house of cards. She stated that she was simply taking what she was owed for wasting her youth on a fraudulent visionary. Paralegals, receptionists, and senior partners stood in the doorways of their offices watching the spectacular public implosion of a tech millionaire and his socialite wife. They did not intervene. They simply observed the vicious destruction of a marriage that had been built entirely on a foundation of mutual greed and toxic ambition. Blake fell to his knees on the marble floor, weeping uncontrollably and begging her to reconsider. He grabbed the hem of her gray blazer, pleading with her not to leave him to face the federal government alone. Courtney simply kicked her expensive shoe out of his grasp, stepped around his sobbing body, and walked out the heavy glass doors into the bleak Seattle afternoon. I observed the entire devastating spectacle from the quiet comfort of a black luxury sedan parked directly across the street. Miles Decker sat in the driver's seat, holding a directional parabolic microphone that had captured every single vicious word exchanged in the lobby. The audio feed piped directly into the vehicle's sound system, wrapping me in the crisp, clear sounds of their mutual annihilation. I sat with my hands resting calmly in my lap, listening to the son who had attempted to steal my estate weeping on a public floor. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or paternal sorrow. I felt the profound, steady satisfaction of an equation finally balancing itself. A structure built on deceit cannot stand. I had simply removed the final load-bearing pillar and watched gravity do the rest. Vincent Navarro sat in the leather passenger seat beside me. He held a sleek tablet connected to the primary corporate servers of Blake's former company. The digital gates were completely under our control. The board of directors had formally ratified my majority ownership and subsequently resigned in mass terror, eager to distance themselves from the impending federal indictments. I was the sole remaining executive authority. I turned my head and looked at Vince. I told him it was time to execute the final phase of the operation. I gave him the absolute unyielding authorization to begin the corporate liquidation. Vince nodded silently. His fingers tapped methodically across the glass screen of the tablet, initiating a sequence of pre-planned financial and legal maneuvers designed to completely dismantle the startup. We did not attempt to salvage the company or rebuild the brand. We operated as ruthless corporate butchers, carving the viable assets out of the infected carcass. The proprietary algorithms and the core source code, the only genuinely valuable intellectual property Blake had ever managed to develop, were instantly auctioned off to a massive rival tech conglomerate. The transaction was executed at a highly aggressive discount, ensuring a rapid all-cash transfer directly into the secure holding accounts I controlled. Vince then systematically broke every single commercial lease, terminating the expensive downtown office spaces and paying the minimal contractual penalties. We liquidated the physical infrastructure. The rows of high-end servers, the thousands of dollars worth of ergonomic office furniture. The imported espresso machines and the aesthetic lobby decorations were sold to commercial liquidators for pennies on the dollar. Every single tangible asset was completely wiped from the corporate registry. We aggressively called in all outstanding accounts receivable, forcing minor clients to pay their debts immediately under threat of aggressive litigation. The resulting river of capital was pooled into the central treasury. As the absolute majority shareholder and the primary secured creditor, I stood at the very front of the line for repayment. I directed Vince to execute the full conversion of my initial convertible debt note. I did not merely recoup the original seed capital I had provided to Blake 3 years ago. I enforced every single aggressive penalty clause, every late fee, and the maximum allowable compounding interest legally permitted by the state. I extracted millions of dollars from the liquidated carcass of his dream, transferring the vast fortune completely back into my own private, impenetrable holding companies. I watched the numbers on Vince's tablet shift and finalize. I had completely recovered my entire investment, multiplied by a staggering margin. I had secured my financial future and successfully protected the estate my late wife and I had built together. The surgical extraction was absolutely flawless. I looked at the final status of Blake's former empire. Once the viable assets were sold and my secured debt was fully satisfied, the company ceased to exist as a functional entity. What remained was a hollow, empty corporate shell. The treasury held exactly $0 However, the corporate liabilities remained fully intact. Blake was now the former chief executive of a non-existent company saddled with millions of dollars in outstanding vendor debts, breached contract penalties, and severe federal tax liabilities. Courtney had drained the operating funds, and I had legally seized the remaining asset value, leaving Blake holding an entirely empty bag. He would be personally pursued by aggressive creditors, ruthless collection agencies, and the unforgiving agents of the federal government for the rest of his natural life. He would never secure another loan. He would never found another company, and he would never again experience the intoxicating illusion of power. I looked out the tinted window of the sedan. The heavy rain continued to wash over the city streets. I saw Blake stumble out of the law firm doors. His shoulders were slumped, his head hung low, and his entire body shook with the devastating realization of his total ruin. He possessed no wife, no company, no home, and no future. The parasite had attempted to consume the host entirely, underestimating the resilience of the organism. The host had simply isolated the infection, starved it of all vital resources, and expelled it permanently from the system. I did not roll down the window. I did not offer him a final glance or a parting word of advice. I had already spoken my absolute truth. I turned my attention away from the broken man on the sidewalk and looked toward the horizon. I instructed Miles to put the car in gear and drive me home. The engine hummed with quiet, immense power as the luxury sedan pulled away from the curb, leaving Blake standing completely alone in the freezing Seattle rain to face the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless arrogance. The heavy gray clouds over the Seattle skyline finally broke, allowing a cold morning light to wash over the affluent neighborhood. I parked my rented sedan directly across the street from the massive iron gates of the estate. The heater in the car hummed a quiet, steady rhythm against the chill of the damp air. I rested my hands on the leather steering wheel and stared through the rain-streaked windshield at the sprawling mansion. Exactly 14 days had passed since the process server handed Blake the commercial eviction notice in the middle of his lavish celebration. The legal countdown had reached its absolute end. There were no extensions granted and no last-minute appeals filed. The property no longer belonged to my holding company. It belonged to the commercial developers, and they were incredibly eager to claim their new territory. Down at the end of the manicured street, a line of heavy yellow machinery sat idling. 3 massive bulldozers and 2 excavators were parked on the shoulder of the road. Their diesel engines rumbled with a deep guttural vibration that I could physically feel even from inside my sealed vehicle. The construction crews leaned against the massive metal tracks, drinking coffee from paper cups and checking their watches. They were simply waiting for the exact minute the legal possession transferred so they could tear down the stone pillars and rip up the imported marble floors. They viewed the mansion not as a home but as an obstacle, a structure of glass and stone that needed to be violently pulverized to make way for high-density, budget-friendly townhouses. I watched the thick, black exhaust smoke rise from the yellow machines, feeling a profound sense of closure. The heavy oak front door of the mansion swung open. Blake and Courtney walked out onto the grand stone portico. There were no professional moving trucks parked in the circular driveway. There were no teams of uniformed men carefully wrapping designer furniture in padded blankets. The total freeze on their financial assets, executed by Vincent Navarro, meant they had absolutely no liquid capital to hire any assistants. They were entirely on their own. Courtney was not wearing her backless silk gowns or her pristine high heels. She wore a pair of stained sweatpants and a shapeless gray sweater, her hair tied back in a frantic, messy knot. Blake looked like a hollow shadow of the arrogant tech executive he had once been. He wore a faded hooded sweatshirt, and his shoulders were slumped with the crushing weight of his absolute defeat. They were dragging heavy black plastic garbage bags out the front door. The bags bulged with whatever clothes and personal items they could stuff inside them before the deadline expired. Courtney struggled with a particularly overstuffed bag. The thin plastic caught on the edge of the rough stone step and tore wide open. A cascade of expensive designer shoes and delicate silk blouses spilled out onto the wet, muddy driveway. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, frantically gathering the ruined luxury items and shoving them back into the torn plastic. Blake did not stop to help her. He simply kept his head down and dragged his own load toward the rusted secondary vehicle they had managed to borrow from a reluctant acquaintance. The sheer physical humiliation of their labor was absolute. They were carrying the rotting remnants of their fake empire in the exact same bags used to discard common refuse. I watched them walk back and forth between the grand doorway and the rusted car. The rain began to fall again, a fine freezing mist that clung to their clothes and made the stone driveway treacherous and slick. Blake slipped on the wet marble, his knee slamming hard against the ground. He let out a visible cry of pain and frustration, throwing his hands into the air. He looked up at the gray sky as if demanding an explanation from the universe for his catastrophic misfortune. He believed he was a victim of immense cruelty. He fundamentally refused to understand that the universe was merely balancing a ledger he had intentionally corrupted. Courtney yelled at him from the porch, demanding he get up and keep moving, because the construction crews at the end of the street were inching their machines closer to the property line. The panic in her voice was palpable, even through the thick glass of my car window. They disappeared into the empty house one final time. The minutes ticked by and the diesel engines of the bulldozers roared louder, signaling the end of the grace period. Blake and Courtney emerged from the doorway, carrying something together. It was not a piece of expensive art or a box of valuable electronics. It was a cheap folding plastic table. The legs were made of thin, scuffed metal, and the white plastic surface was deeply stained and heavily scratched. They maneuvered the awkward piece of furniture down the stone steps, struggling to fit it into the trunk of the borrowed car. My eyes locked onto that specific table, and a vivid, visceral memory surfaced from the depths of my mind. It was a memory from 2 years ago during the Thanksgiving holiday. Courtney had insisted on hosting a massive, extravagant dinner for her wealthy friends and local social media influencers. She had rented imported crystal glasses and hired a private catering team to serve expensive cuts of meat. When I arrived at the house expecting to sit with my son and share a family meal, I was intercepted by Courtney in the hallway. She told me the main dining room was entirely full, and the aesthetic of the evening required a certain younger demographic. She had set up that exact cheap plastic table in a dark, drafty corner of the kitchen near the cold service entrance. She placed a single thin paper plate and a flimsy plastic fork on the scratched surface. Blake had walked into the kitchen, seen me sitting completely alone at the folding table, and simply shrugged his shoulders before returning to his wealthy guests. They had relegated me to the shadows, treating me like an unwanted stray animal that needed to be hidden away from polite society. Now they were dragging that same pathetic piece of plastic into the freezing rain. It was highly likely the only piece of furniture they were legally allowed to take, or perhaps the only item that would fit into their miserable new reality. They were desperately clinging to the very object they had used to systematically humiliate me. The symmetry of the moment was mathematically perfect. The universe possesses an incredible sense of absolute irony. They had forced me to eat scraps in the dark, and now they were scavenging for scraps in the mud, while their fraudulent empire crumbled around them. I sat in the quiet warmth of my car and monitored my own internal pulse. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of paternal sorrow. I looked for a flicker of regret or a sudden desire to roll down my window and offer them a final financial lifeline. I found absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my blood, and there was no pity in my soul. I did not feel the fiery rush of vengeance or the bitter taste of resentment. Instead, I felt the profound, sterile calmness of a medical professional. When a surgeon identifies a malignant tumor slowly poisoning a healthy body, he does not feel empathy for the diseased tissue. He simply takes a scalpel, cuts the cancer out of the host, and drops it into a biological waste bin. He feels only the cold, sharp relief of a successful excision. At the far end of the street, the foreman of the demolition crew blew a loud, compressed air horn. The sound pierced the damp Seattle morning, echoing off the large houses. The massive yellow bulldozers lurched forward, their heavy metal tracks grinding violently against the asphalt. They rolled toward the iron gates of the estate, exhaling thick plumes of black diesel smoke. The ground literally trembled beneath their immense, terrifying weight. Blake and Courtney froze in the driveway, standing next to their borrowed car and their torn garbage bags. They watched the machines advance with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the physical destruction of their fantasy was absolutely unstoppable. The lead bulldozer reached the property line and did not hesitate for a single second. The heavy steel blade slammed directly into the massive brick pillar supporting the intricate iron gate. The structure cracked, shattered, and collapsed inward, sending a huge, thick cloud of mortar dust into the freezing rain. Blake dropped to his knees in the mud next to the cheap plastic table, burying his face in his dirty hands. Courtney turned her back on the collapsing gate and stared blankly at the wet pavement, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of her new life. They were entirely broken, stripped of their unearned wealth, their fraudulent status, and their toxic pride. The excision was complete, and the patient was finally free to heal. I reached forward and shifted the sedan into drive. I took my foot off the brake and let the car pull smoothly away from the curb. I drove slowly down the street, passing the line of heavy machinery tearing into the earth. I did not look back a single time in the rearview mirror. I merged onto the main highway, leaving the rain and the ruins completely behind me, moving forward into a quiet, peaceful, and entirely unburdened future. The heavy luxury sedan crawled toward the exit of the affluent neighborhood. Miles Decker steered the vehicle slowly, avoiding the massive yellow bulldozers that were actively swarming the street. I sat in the rear passenger seat, watching the rain wash down the tinted glass. The demolition crew had already breached the perimeter of the estate, and the structural tearing of metal and stone echoed through the damp morning air. We were forced to a temporary halt at the main intersection as a flatbed truck carrying an excavator blocked the narrow road. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw a figure moving erratically along the cracked sidewalk. It was Blake. He had abandoned Courtney and the garbage bags full of ruined designer clothes in the muddy driveway. He was walking toward my idling vehicle. He moved with a heavy, dragging limp, completely stripped of the arrogant swagger that had defined his entire adult existence. The expensive, tailored suit he wore was thoroughly destroyed by the mud and the freezing downpour. He looked incredibly small. He approached the rear passenger side of the sedan and placed his bare, trembling hands on the wet glass. He leaned his weight against the door, as if his legs could no longer support his own body. He did not pound his fists or scream in a manic rage. The violent hostility that had fueled his initial confrontation at the hotel was entirely gone. He was thoroughly defeated. He stared through the dark tint, searching for my face in the shadows of the plush cabin. I reached over and pressed the button on the door panel. The electric motor hummed quietly as the glass rolled down, exposing the warm, dry interior of the car to the freezing Seattle storm. The cold wind immediately swept into the back seat, bringing with it the harsh mechanical sounds of the estate being torn apart. Blake stood shivering in the rain. His face was pale and drawn, and his eyes were hollow, empty voids. The manic tech visionary who had boasted about ruthlessly shedding dead weight was nowhere to be found. He looked at me with a pathetic, desperate expression. He asked me a single question, his voice barely a whisper over the rumbling diesel engines of the construction equipment. He asked if it was worth it. He asked if destroying my own son brought me the satisfaction I wanted. I looked at the broken man standing in the mud. The clash of our ideologies was perfectly crystallized in that single pathetic question. Blake had lived his entire life subscribing to an ideology of supreme entitlement. He believed that his actions carried no consequences because the world owed him a safety net. He believed that aesthetics and aggressive public relations could manipulate reality indefinitely. He operated under the assumption that he could steal, defraud, and humiliate those who loved him without ever paying a physical or emotional toll. He still desperately needed to frame himself as the tragic victim of a malicious external force. He still fundamentally refused to understand the mechanics of his own downfall. He believed that I was the vicious architect of his misery, rather than the silent mirror reflecting his own catastrophic failures. He wanted me to feel the crushing weight of parental guilt. He wanted me to carry the burden of his ruined marriage, his evaporated company, and his impending federal criminal charges. My ideology was grounded entirely in structural integrity and undeniable truth. A bridge built on rotten supports will inevitably fall into the river, regardless of how beautiful the paint looks. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I sat perfectly still in the leather seat and let his pathetic accusation hang in the freezing air. I observed the total collapse of his moral and financial architecture. He had built his entire life on a foundation of parasitic greed and arrogant deception. He had forged medical documents to lock me in a psychiatric facility. He had stolen my assets to fund his extravagant illusions. He had stood in my dining room and demanded that I surrender my independence so he could maintain his hollow status among the Seattle elite. I kept my voice completely level and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. I told him that I did not destroy him. I explained that an engineer does not destroy a building by simply walking away from a collapsing structure. I told him that I simply stopped shielding him from himself. I detailed how I had spent his entire life reinforcing his weak foundations, quietly paying for his mistakes and absorbing the impact of his reckless decisions. I told him that my financial support and my silent endurance were the only load-bearing pillars keeping his artificial world from falling apart. I looked deeply into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. I reminded him of the exact words he had used against me when he thought he held absolute power. I told him that he had demanded I stop taking up space in his world. I explained that he viewed my existence as a burden and my presence as a parasite feeding off his supposed greatness. I stated with absolute chilling finality that I had simply obliged his request. I had removed myself and my resources entirely from his ecosystem. The destruction he was currently experiencing was not an act of revenge. It was simply the natural mathematical result of a hollow structure collapsing under its own massive weight once the temporary scaffolding was removed. Blake opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The devastating, absolute truth of my words paralyzed his vocal cords. He could no longer hide behind his fabricated narratives or his vicious blaming. He was forced to stand in the freezing rain and look directly at the monster he had created. He realized that the father he had discarded was the only entity that had ever truly protected him. His arrogant assumption of invincibility was washed away, leaving nothing but the cold realization of his own profound incompetence. I did not offer him a parting gesture of forgiveness. I did not extend a hand to pull him out of the cold. The protective bond of blood and family had been permanently and irreversibly severed by his own treacherous hands. The surgical excision was absolutely complete. The malignant tissue was successfully isolated and permanently removed from the host. I pressed the button on the door panel. The tinted glass smoothly rolled up, sealing the warm cabin and cutting off the sounds of the storm and the demolition. I turned my gaze forward, looking through the windshield at the road clearing ahead. The flatbed truck had finally moved out of the intersection. I instructed Miles to proceed. The luxury sedan accelerated smoothly, leaving the shattered remnants of my past behind. Blake remained standing in the mud, watching the car disappear into the gray morning, entirely alone with the total permanent devastation of his own choices. 6 months had passed since the heavy Seattle rain washed away the final remnants of a fabricated empire. The air out here was vastly different. It was crisp, clean, and carried the sharp, invigorating scent of ancient pine trees and untouched earth. Ken sat on the wide wraparound porch of a stunning timber-framed cabin nestled deep within the remote mountains of Montana. The morning sun crept slowly over the jagged snow-capped peaks, casting long golden rays across the frost-covered valley below. There were no sirens here. There were no frantic phone calls demanding emergency funds, and there were no manipulative voices dripping with false affection. The profound silence of the wilderness was broken only by the gentle rustle of the wind through the evergreen branches and the occasional distant call of a red-tailed hawk. Ken took a slow, deep breath, letting the freezing mountain air fill his lungs. He exhaled a long white plume of breath and wrapped his weathered hands around a thick ceramic mug of dark black coffee. The heat seeped into his palms, anchoring him to the absolute tranquility of the present moment. He was wearing a heavy flannel shirt and a thick canvas jacket. They were simple, durable clothes meant for surviving the elements rather than projecting a hollow status to strangers. He leaned back in his sturdy wooden rocking chair, listening to the rhythmic creak of the runners against the floorboards. The sprawling cabin behind him was not a monument to vanity. It was a fortress of peace built with massive cedar logs and local stone designed to withstand the harshest winters. It was paid for in full, acquired with a fraction of the capital he had legally and surgically extracted from the toxic shell of his former life. Resting on the small wooden side table next to his coffee mug was a sleek silver laptop. It was a quiet, unassuming morning, but the digital world still occasionally reached out to him. A soft chime echoed from the small speakers, indicating an incoming message. Ken slowly reached over and opened the screen. The bright white light of the display contrasted sharply with the soft, natural glow of the mountain sunrise. The message was from Vincent Navarro. Vince had remained in Seattle, acting as the silent, efficient custodian of Ken's diversified portfolio. The email was brief, professional, and entirely devoid of emotional commentary. It contained the final quarterly update on the fallout of the liquidation and the subsequent federal investigations. Ken adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the plain black text. The facts were laid out with the sterile precision of an autopsy report. Blake had completely exhausted his legal appeals and had narrowly avoided a lengthy federal prison sentence by agreeing to a massive, crushing schedule of financial restitution. To meet the aggressive monthly payments demanded by the court, Blake had been forced to secure immediate employment. He was currently working as a mid-level shift manager at a regional logistics warehouse. The man who had once stood in a glass boardroom and arrogantly declared himself a tech visionary was now wearing a plastic name tag, clocking in before dawn, and managing inventory disputes under flickering fluorescent lights. Every single dollar he earned above the absolute bare minimum required for basic survival was automatically garnished by the federal government. The email continued with a brief update on Courtney. Her attempt to secure immunity by betraying Blake had only partially succeeded. While she had avoided a criminal conviction, her extensive financial liabilities and the total seizure of her assets had left her completely destitute. Without the corporate funds to maintain her lavish lifestyle or pay her mounting legal fees, she had officially filed for personal bankruptcy. The designer wardrobes, the luxury vehicles, and the offshore crypto wallets were entirely gone. She was currently living in a cramped, rented room in a dreary suburb, completely ostracized by the wealthy socialite friends who had eagerly consumed the expensive dinners paid for with stolen money. Ken read the words on the glowing screen. He read them a second time, letting the stark reality of their new lives sink into his mind. He searched his heart for any lingering trace of paternal grief. He searched for a shadow of guilt or a sudden urge to reach out and offer a small measure of comfort to the son he had once loved. He found absolutely nothing. The internal reservoir of blind, unconditional forgiveness had been permanently drained by decades of abuse, entitlement, and treacherous greed. In its place was a profound, unshakable equilibrium. Ken did not feel the fiery, triumphant joy of a vindictive conqueror. He felt the cold, sharp, and absolute relief of a surgeon who had successfully removed a malignant parasite from his own body. He had not destroyed Blake or Courtney. He had simply stopped altering the universe to protect them from the consequences of their own actions. He had stopped absorbing their failures. He had stopped fueling their delusions with his own lifeblood. His thoughts briefly drifted to their final encounter outside the Seattle estate. Blake had spotted Ken's idling car and approached it stripped of all his former arrogance. Blake had looked through the open window and asked a single pathetic question. He had asked if it was worth it. He had asked if destroying his own son brought Ken the satisfaction he wanted. Ken remembered his exact reply. He remembered speaking with a quiet, devastating clarity. He had told Blake that he did not destroy him. He explained that he simply stopped shielding him from himself. Ken had reminded his son of the brutal ultimatum delivered in the dining room weeks earlier. He told Blake that he had demanded his father stop taking up space in his world. Ken had simply obliged the request permanently. Ken reached out and closed the laptop. The screen went black, and the quiet, satisfying click of the metallic latch echoed clearly on the wooden porch. He set the machine aside and picked up his coffee mug. He looked out over the vast, unbroken expanse of the Montana wilderness. The valley stretched out for miles, an endless sea of green pine and gray stone, completely untouched by the frantic, desperate greed of the city. He was entirely alone. There were no children visiting for the holidays. There was no wife to share the morning sunrise. But for the very first time in his adult life, the profound solitude did not feel like a heavy, crushing burden. It felt like absolute, unadulterated freedom. His boundaries were finally secure. His dignity was completely intact. The relentless, exhausting war to protect his soul from those who shared his blood was officially over. Ken took a final, slow sip of his coffee, closing his eyes and letting the gentle mountain breeze wash over his face. The ledger was perfectly balanced. The toxic host was eradicated, and his life finally and truly belonged entirely to him. The lesson woven into this narrative is a stark reminder about the profound danger of ungrateful arrogance and the absolute necessity of recognizing the silent pillars that support our lives. True power does not reside in loud public declarations of superiority or the ruthless exploitation of familial bonds. It lies in the quiet, enduring sacrifices of those who genuinely care for us. When we mistake patience for weakness and generosity for dependency, we risk severing the very roots that sustain our success. Respect is the fundamental currency of any enduring relationship, and once bankrupt, the resulting isolation is complete and entirely self-inflicted. Please share your thoughts on this story in the comments below, and subscribe for more narratives about resilience and justice.